Well, tonight, as we've heard, we're starting a series on a marvelous book of Daniel. Isn't it hard when you are different? The other day, I was invited to a lunch in the Cotswolds, dress smart casual. After a consultation with my resident and usually infallible fashion guru, I went in an open-necked shirt. What my normally infallible guru had forgotten was that most people there were of a certain age and a certain standing. To them, smart casual was a jacket and tie, club tie if possible. I just felt a little alien. We're going to read a story about 4 men thrown into a totally alien culture, and Chris is going to come and read it to us. Chris. And this story is Daniel chapter 1, which is on, if you've got your Pew Bibles, is on page something or other. Here we are, page 838.
Thank you, Peter. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to do this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds, literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them and found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom.
Thank you so much. The world of Daniel and his friends had collapsed. Foreign soldiers were in their streets. Precious articles from the temple had been carted off to Babylon. And then the Babylonian headhunters arrived at work. And they were looking for the most gifted people around, as Mary tells us, guys with six-pack bodies, handsome enough effortlessly to sweep most girls off their foot, with to boot the equivalent of 11 A-star GCSEs and Oxbridge places virtually assured. Now, most of us men would like to feel that we ticked all those boxes, though some of us know that we don't. But for our heroes, it meant exile to the country of their hated conquerors. Different culture, different language, different food, different clothes. It meant becoming a tiny little group of God-fearers in a place where everybody else followed a different God. Never again, in all likelihood, seeing their parents and neighbors, never again glimpsing the beautiful scenery that they'd been brought up in, never again being able to speak freely for fear they might be misunderstood. It meant always being second class, always at the beck and call of their captor. And there's a magnificent description of the emotions of these Jews in Psalm 137. Listen to this. Alongside Babylon's rivers, we sat on the banks. We cried and cried, remembering the good old days of Zion. Alongside the quaking aspens, we stacked our unplayed harps. That's where our captors demanded songs, sarcastic and mocking. Sing us a happy Zion song. Oh, how could we ever sing God's song in this wasteland? You feel, do you not, the cry of pain, of anguish from them. Now, none of us are remotely like that, but perhaps just in a little way, some of us hear God mocked in school. Perhaps when we have to be part of a discussion of work, we hear absolutely no moral reference to the points that we would regard as being very important in that discussion. Perhaps when we're part of conversations, when the constant theme is doing down somebody else, our neighbor, or somebody else in the vicinity. Perhaps when we share, perhaps we can share enough sense of being aliens because we follow God, to enter a little bit into the experience of these guys. Now, how should we react? How should we react when we are in an alien culture? Fundamentally, there are three different ways. Two of them are right and one of them is wrong. The first is becoming part of a ghetto. Now, Daniel and his friends could have formed a ghetto of like-minded people who spoke like them, who thought like them, who acted like them. They could have taken every opportunity to say how hopeless and useless the people on the other side of the ghetto were because they weren't like them. They could have become part of what one might call the dinosaur syndrome. Now, dinosaurs are lovely, as long as you don't come in contact with them, but they're irrelevant relics. They have no link to today. So that's one way. The second course they might have taken was to become completely integrated. Daniel and his friends could have become completely absorbed into the alien Babylonian culture. And that's the look-alike syndrome. And we see this syndrome quite often. There are Christians who want to look exactly like the world around them. There are great pains to strip away anything in the gospel, anything in the Bible, and anything in the church's teaching that might be challenging to that culture. If Daniel and his friends had become like that, they would have become the same as the culture around them. And they would have become like the first group of people, the ghetto people, they would have become irrelevant. If you're the same as everybody, you don't have anything much to say to them. I want next to show you one of the truly the most obscene pictures I've ever seen. It's of a German Protestant bishop called Ludwig Müller giving the Nazi salute outside, along with brown shirts in Wittenberg, the place where Luther began the Reformation in the early 1930s. And it's a symbol of how far much of Christianity in Germany came to acquiesce and support the Hitler and the Nazi policy. Had it been otherwise, had they stood out, we might never have heard of Hitler. But because there was so much integration, there was so much acceptance, we can get pictures like that. The third way is to be part of, but distinctive from our culture. Be part of, but distinctive from our culture. Notice that those guys in the picture are eating something different. Daniel and his companions chose a third way, and that was to integrate with the society and culture they were in, but to remain different from it, because their first allegiance was to the Lord. And that is the wisdom syndrome. We've just sung, "Give me wisdom, Lord." And that's exactly what these guys were, I imagine, singing. The wisdom syndrome means trusting the Lord and seeking at each point to think and pray through what he wants us to do. It's very demanding, but it happens actually to be the way the Lord calls us to live. And that's why Daniel and his friends have so much to teach us today, because we're in a culture not altogether different from that Babylonian culture. It's God's way of making us relevant to where he has placed us. And actually, the people of Judah have been given very clear advice by the prophet Jeremiah as to what they were doing in exile. Settle down, he said. This is Jeremiah 29. Settle down. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Okay, Jeremiah is saying, you may feel displaced. And all of us are, in a sense, displaced. We're not any one of us in a perfect place. Remember that the Lord, more often than not, wants us to work for him in the place he has placed us in the place we might think is our displaced place. And actually, as Daniel and his friends began to do this, they discovered that the Babylonian culture was not all bad. Let's look at it. The alien Babylonian culture, first of all, wanted to use the gifts of these men. The Babylonians went through the selection process that we've read about, and they wanted the Jews because they realized that they had something to give them. Secondly, they showed favor and sympathy. The Babylonians showed favor and sympathy to Daniel. Verses 9 and 10 make it clear that the officials came to like Daniel and his friends. And it often happens like that. We emphasize quite rightly that being a Christian brings its fair share of hostility and persecution. But isn't it true that not infrequently people actually admire, though they don't necessarily always say it, they actually admire Christian qualities and values? A few weeks ago, you may remember, there was a very gloomy poll about the decline of Christianity. Now, the Guardian newspaper, not noted for its love of Christians, wrote an editorial which instead of rejoicing, as one might have expected, that the Christianity was vanishing away, pointed out that we need a moral vision beyond a nature red in tooth and claw. We need, and I quote, a vision of humanity that transcends narrow self-interest. If Christianity no longer can supply that, what will? That's the Guardian. If it can no longer supply that, what will? The popularity of Theresa May's Christian vision. of a more equal society is another indicator, it seems to me, of the sympathy and indeed admiration of Christian qualities and values. Returning to this story, we find that the guard showed so much favor and sympathy towards Daniel that he was prepared to agree to a test, very likely to fail, to bring, from his point of view, to fail and to bring disaster on him, feeding these Jews on vegetables and water. Now, all with our specialist knowledge of diet, we might actually think that was much better diet than the king's diet. But the guard had no such knowledge. He risked the king's displeasure, and the king's displeasure meant that he would lose his head very quickly. But he took this brave step because he'd come to like and respect and honor Daniel and his friends. Let's not always expect hostility from the alien culture out there. Thirdly, that alien culture actually had good in it. The foreword taught, verse 17, tells us all kinds of literature and learning. And they were learning from pagan literature. Just because it was pagan, it wasn't all bad. God gave them understanding as they learned, as they grappled with the books that they read. And there's a challenge. Are we using all the resources we have to understand the world in which we've been placed? Are we seeking wisdom from whatever source it may come? And it'll come from all sorts of sources, of course, primarily from God. But God can use all sorts of different sources to bring it to us about, are we seeking wisdom about our world? And the Babylonian culture was treated, fourthly, positively by Daniel and his friends. Throughout Daniel, there's an undercurrent of goodwill between Daniel and the Babylonians. Look at the polite and reasonable way he asks for an exception to be made in his treatment. He might have been rude and aggressive and negative. And if he had, he would have been thrown out. If he'd been thrown out, he could not have fulfilled God's role for him in being part of, but distinctive from, the culture in which he'd been placed. Now let's briefly, as we come to a close, turn our eyes to looking at what the Lord is doing in this story. The Lord, first of all, was in control. And that's clear from the very start. Verse 2 tells us that God was behind the defeat of Judah. It's clear again in verse 10 when we're told that God caused the guard to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. Again in verse 17, where it is God who gives men knowledge and understanding. And it's confidence in God's control that allows Daniel to take that brave step of saying, I'm not going to take the king's food. I'm going to feed on water and vegetables only. The Lord, secondly, required Daniel to be dependent on him. You may have been wondering why Daniel made a point of not taking the king's food. It wasn't forbidden to Jews to do it. And many think it may have been because taking the king's food would have implied dependence on the king, who was regarded as being practically God. It was a symbol of total acceptance of his rule. And this Daniel and his friends could never accept. They were totally dependent on God. Therefore, they could not be totally dependent on the king at the same time. And if we're following the Lord, we are we not the same? There is no state, no business, no sport, no hobby, no person that can demand our total allegiance apart from our Lord. And when they do demand our allegiance, we have to resist. And that's why I believe these young men refused to eat. And thirdly, the Lord supported Daniel when he stood for him. Did the Lord let Daniel and his friends down? Of course he didn't. He was with them and he delivered them. And when the king came to test them, he found extraordinarily that they were 10 times better in their knowledge and in their understanding than anybody else. And as the band come up now, I want just to focus our minds on 5 questions which come out of this. As we close, I want us to focus on the place that we're in, whether it's our school, whether it's our home, whether it's our work, whether it's our neighborhood, whether it's our sports club, whatever it may be. And just to leave you with these 5 questions in relation to it. First of all, what is there to be positive about and to affirm in the place God has put me in? What is there to be positive about and to affirm in the place God has put me? Secondly, what is the Lord calling me to do for him in that place? Thirdly, is there something he may be calling me not to do? Fourthly, have I shared this with my Christian friends and leaders for support and guidance? And fifthly, am I trusting him in that place?